politically correct, haven't been able to call a thing. What I am very, very grateful in this moment is that I can lead these conversations and say, we're coming in to do anti-racism work, right? Whereas
Mm-hmm.
before I would, leverage it and say, hey, can I come in and do a culture and climate assessment for you? And that's important that we call a thing. When we talk about policies that really and truly gloss over certain student demographics, we want to go in and address those.
School is in. But are you really ready to learn? Open your eyes to a new day in education with The Awakening Educator, a program specifically designed to explore a new, mindful way of educating our youth. Learn about social-emotional learning, new modalities of teaching, and the most relevant topics in education with your hosts, Susan Andrian and Megan Sweet. Susan and Megan will take you inside the issues by looking at them from different points of view, from policies and research to teaching models that are actually used in schools. There's never a dull moment in this classroom. Have any questions you'd like to ask? Maybe you have knowledge you'd like to share, and share your thoughts live on air. Grab a pen and paper and get ready to open your textbooks and minds to a new way of learning on The Awakening Educator.
All right, you're back. We're back.
Okay.
We lost for a minute and we took a break.
Okay.
I as you were talking, there were a couple of things that I was thinking about, and really, Megan, I really appreciate you talking about the role of white folks in addressing these systemic issues. And and for me, I always think about it, the fear of giving up the power, the fear of acknowledging that if I acknowledge that these systems are racist, if I acknowledge that white supremacy is part of everything that we do and every system that we interact with, then I have to look at myself, and that is scary, and people don't want to do that piece.
Right.
And I'm also thinking about these ways in which you said something about the data that I think is so important, and I think sometimes people gloss over the data. They're afraid to, like, I've had parents who have told me they got to middle school and did not know that their kids were 3 or 4 grades behind. And we sat with those parents with the data of their child's, like, where they were academically. And the parent was like, but they come home with A's every week. How is my child 3 years behind? But their grades have not reflect this. Right. And the teachers were too afraid to have those really difficult, honest conversations about where kids actually are academically and how we can move them to, how we can support and move them to get home. So I'm wondering how you support schools to actually, let's look at it. Let's put it out in the light.
Yeah.
There is a realization that all educators have to come to some kind of conclusion when we look at data, right? Because the numbers don't lie. And the reality is, when we look at the data, if we are really concerned about serving all students, and we start from those students where the data shows that there's a gap, we are serving better all students. So we are meeting the needs of, so if we're specializing, and I'm not saying that all students don't deserve a quality education. What I'm saying is, because there are gaps, where we meet the needs of the gaps will better lift up that group of students, right, who are failing, or who are failing the earmarkers, like, say, maybe it's the state testing, right? Maybe it's the moving from grade level to grade level. Maybe it's the literacy grade, right? Maybe it's the number of students who are students of color who are not enrolling in AB classes. So when we look at those kind of data, we can then begin to honestly address where the gaps are. Right. And so if you lift from there, all students will benefit, right? It's like that bell curve. You lift the whole, those at the bottom of the curve, you're lifting the whole curve. And so that's one area. The other area is that we have to be very intentional about is representation. And I always pause when I say that, because oftentimes folks who don't or haven't walked a life that has included struggle and trauma and oppression, and they have lived from a very privileged standpoint, oftentimes they feel it's a matter of blame and shame, and they make it about themselves, the individual. And I'm saying completely the opposite, that this is a systemic problem. This is an institutional problem. This is a structural problem. And so I'm not mad at anybody alive today who benefits from the systems that were built by our ancestors. What I'm mad about is those people who have privilege and they see that there's a problem with the system, and they don't want to allow for access to be given to those who continually, generation after generation, to lack benefit and access to the very same generational access that other students have had the opportunity to experience. And so that's what the data says. The data says that if your grandparent owned a home, that they, living in that neighborhood, that the taxes went into the school system, and that it was a positive experience because that school was able to afford to do X, Y, and Z. But if you live in an urban area where the tax base is lower and there's not a home ownership base, then the schools don't get fed the needed resources to build up what those students need. And so that's economics. And it's very much tied into where we are socioeconomically and how we deliver on those outcomes when it comes to education.
Right. But Sonia, you're talking Megan's like, she's all about finance. So I'm gonna punt it over there.
So we've had this woman on our show, and she's one of my mentors, Delaney, who's a former state superintendent for California. And she said our budgets are value statements, really. And so our budgets are showing that we don't value education, period, but definitely not prioritizing increasing access and opportunity to our students of color and our underrepresented students within our districts across the country, frankly, and our educators, right? So it's been my latest thing that I've been kind of focused on. But if we pay our teachers so low, and we have the bar to becoming a teacher so low, because we're so desperate to have someone come into the room, because we are also, Susan and I were saying before you came on that we're also at this like severe teacher shortage and substitute shortage. Then we're going to, but when we have the bars low like that, then we allow people into the room that actually aren't prepared to support our children effectively. And they're not bad people. And this isn't, again, I'm not criticizing any human being or educators in general, but we're saying educators, because I think actually educators are like so high quality and such dynamic, capable people, but we as a society are undervaluing them with how we pay them. When that happens, then what we're doing is we're causing harm to our kids, and the kids who are the most significantly impacted are most underrepresented students, the students from the low income schools and communities, because that tends to be where our newest and least experienced educators go. And so we're not only like talk about, so that's to me is an example of an outcome of our systemic racism and the structures in our country. I don't know if that's where you were going, Susan, with economics.
It is. And thinking about, even concretely that California has, I think it's $7,000 less per student per year than New York State or Massachusetts. And both of those states are always on the top of high performance because they are better funded. And when we look at California, which is one of the richest states in the country,
in the world,
it's the fifth highest
in the world.
And we have the lowest ADA for our kid. It's just it's shocking when folks learn. It's baffling,
and it's because up from like 48 to 42 or something now, but we are still in the bottom quartile.
Absolutely,
for sure.
Embarrassing.
Here's the thing, so when I really thought about educational equity, so let me just give you some backstory. I thought I wanted to be a doctor, and then I thought I wanted to be a lawyer, and then I thought I wanted to be both. But I realized when I was 18 and I arrived at Spelman's campus, I took my freshman entrance exam. Now, mind you, I graduated high school salutatorian of my class, from Sacramento, a high school right here in Sacramento. It was one of the lower achieving schools in my district at the time, but I was in a magnet program, math, science, and engineering. I had graduated high school with a 3.91 GPA, had scored very well on the ACT and SAT, had taken and successfully passed college classes at Consumers River, at Sac City, and at Sac State. I was a tutor to college students who were taking math, at the college level. I took my entrance exams at Spelman, and I failed them miserably in math and in reading. And so I had this, for the first time in my educational career, this sense of failure. I didn't know how to process that. And so I started thinking about, why was I not prepared to compete with folks from other states who are doing so well? Now, I was also accepted into Stanford, into Berkeley, and UCLA. And I oftentimes wonder how I would have been able to compete with individuals who were at those institutions. So I go through my freshman year. I had to take freshman remedial reading, and I didn't get credit for it. Remedial math that I didn't get credit for. So I had to take 2 extra classes compared to my counterparts. And I began to think about these things. When I graduated from college, I went back and I started to look at the data, and I started to say, where are other, in marginalized settings in particular, where are they faring out when they look good on paper, right? Because oftentimes, if a kid looks good, they're polished, they are not a behavior problem, they're involved in extracurricular activities. We sometimes, or teachers and educators and administrators, will sometimes say, look at that student with a smile and say, I'm going to give them an extra bump up. And it made me wonder, did any of my teachers, even though I was in a very rigorous program, if they ever looked at me and say, oh, she's such a nice kid, let's just pass her with a higher grade, that she really, is not competitively performing as we think she is. And so that was of concern to me. And so when I graduated college, I said, I'm going into education. I want to make sure that little brown girls like myself don't have to worry about these issues, and I can be that conduit. I can be that voice of, or that example to, on a school campus. But here's the other part of the data, is that Black and brown teachers don't last in the field of education, and that there isn't a huge retention rate or an effort to keep us, right? I wish that there was someone in my ear saying, Sonia, no, we're going to fix this problem and we're going to make a way for you to stay in the classroom. But there wasn't. I was expendable, and I knew that I was to the point that I knew halfway through my career, probably about year 7, I was like, I know that I'm not going to retire a teacher, because I'm not going to continue to allow my free labor to be given and it not be compensated, and I not, be recognized for all of the other things that my principal and administrators and counselors ask me to do for free. And that's labor. That's labor when you're asking a Black teacher, oh, can you talk to this Black student because I feel like you'd have a connection to them? Can you run the BSU because you're the only Black staff that we have on? Can you work with the cheerleaders because most of them are Black and brown? So those were my experiences in the classroom, and it left me very disgruntled. And I knew that I also would never go into administration, which is, a hard pickle to swallow as well, because I did want to move up at some point. And I just decided that that's not the way that I would advance my career.
You named 2 things that are really important there that I want to tease out, Sonia. The first is, I know you want to go on a break, Susan. I can feel it, but I'm going to go. I'm going to plow ahead, and then we'll go on a break. The first is rigor, right? So when we don't have high, and to me, that's an indication often of implicit biases at play. And I think rigor is a really important thing for us to look at as educators. And when we don't have the same expectations, or we lower our expectations, not intentionally, again, I'm not saying anyone's running around trying to do this to cause harm, but when we lower our expectations, or we give or we don't actually hold kids to, all kids to a high level of expectation, then we're actually actively causing harm. And I think your example is really powerful. The other is around, and maybe this is what we can talk about after the break, because I'm going to follow directions. And which is what happens a lot in initiative. And what I'm not most nervous about, one of the things I'm nervous about right now is there is this renewed or new interest in equity and inclusion and addressing equity, but without actually changing the conditions in which people work and creating true safety within the schools or our offices or wherever we are, we're not going to be able to retain educators of color because it continues to not feel safe to be there. And so it'd be great when we come back from break to talk with you a little bit about what are some ways we might do that. How can we start to create some safety so our educators can stay? How do we help them see and feel like they're valued, but also beyond this, like, okay, we're going to bring in, we're going to have a DEI training, or we're going to hire a new position, which I think I'm seeing a lot of people doing. And I'm hopeful about, but, equity work is not a one and done moment, so it has to be a continual process. And if we're bringing in positions where we're seeking to address equity, how are we going to support those positions to be successful, which is my concern. So,
I want to touch on one more thing when we get back, which is also related to that. And I noted that you talked about always the teacher of color, or the teacher, or the person who is Black or Latino or who's ever on staff, disproportionately having to hold the conversations with families, or the conflicts that show up, or a particular student. And this is coming up for me in the district. And like, how do we support white folks in the building to feel comfortable enough to show up and hold those same conversations within their whiteness? Because that's what we need to happen. It can't be that only Black staff can talk to Black children and Black families. That is not equity. Absolutely. So we are going to go to break.
Are you ready to change the way we do school? Yeah, me too. This is Megan Sweet from The Awakening Educator, and I've designed programming that empowers educators to reimagine how they approach their work. The pandemic has laid bare what most of us already knew. Our schools are under-resourced. Our system is set up to fail our most vulnerable students. Our educators are burned out and overwhelmed, and we all deserve better. With almost 30 years in education and 15 dedicated to leading school reform, I have been there and I get it. I've sat in the same seats that many of you have. I've been a classroom teacher and a school administrator. I've led district, county, and statewide reforms. I've coached dozens of teachers, principals, and executive leaders, and I've partnered with students, parents, and community activists. I have the scars from a lifetime of scrapping out in education, but also the lived experience that change is possible. After facing the prospect of quitting education myself, I began a journey to understand how I could stay in the profession I love, but do it in a way that was sustainable. Here's what I now know. It begins with self-care. Prioritizing ourselves can feel counterintuitive for educators, but when we give without attending to our own needs, eventually we run out of resources and burnout ensues. But when we stop fighting the system and instead look inward for the answers we seek, we live more empowered lives and are better able to create the educational settings where our students will thrive. Here's what I also know. We already have the answers inside of us, we just sometimes need help getting them out. And that's where I come in. I love supporting educators to find their inner voice and match all those school smarts with their innate instincts about what works best for students. My superpowers are listening well, synthesizing ideas, and breaking complex processes into understandable and accessible parts. How will we do it? It all starts with doing what I call self-work, dedicating time and attention to building a relationship with ourselves. We do this in a course I call the Beliefs Lab. By the end of this course, you'll understand why self-care is essential for being an effective educator, and you'll have strategies you can use right now. You will also get a handle on some of those beliefs that are helping you and those that are getting in the way. The next step is doing the school work, leading classroom and school change. In the course I call The Cycle, you will learn a process for realizing goals for yourself and for your educational context simultaneously. You will also have deeper insights and strategies for putting your plans into action. Want more support as you engage in this self-work and schoolwork? I've got you covered. My personalized coaching and consulting services are designed to meet you in your school right where you are and support you to clarify your vision for the future. Want to know even more about what I do? My book is a great place to start. An Educator's Guide for Using Your 3 Eyes details the self-work and schoolwork that I described above and talks about concrete ways that you can start to feel better right now. If you want to learn more about how to work with me in the courses I just described, please come to my website, www.your3eyes.com. That's YOUR, the number 3, EYES.com. I can't wait to support you to realize a better future for yourself and for your school community.
Welcome back to the Awakening Educator. We are so excited to have Sonia Lewis with us today talking about equity. It's been already a rich conversation. And before we went on break, we had a number of different areas that Megan and I wanted to go in. I do really want to think about retention of educators, Black educators and educators of color, because I think that as we think about the teacher shortage and the importance of having folks in the building who really can shift cultures so that we are creating spaces that feel safe. I'm curious, Sonia, what are some of the ways you think we can, as a system, start to address the barriers that are preventing educators from color staying or from entering the field in the first place? Oh, I think we're losing you.
I think she'll come back. We'll hang on for a minute.
We'll hang on. And I can edit this part out. So welcome back again, and I'll edit this whole thing out. Yeah, you want to bring us back in?
I think we could do the welcome back again when Sonia comes, but I think we could also talk a little bit around some context, because sometimes I wonder if folks that are new-ish to education might not understand what we're talking about. I thought Sonia's example was so important around the additional burden and responsibility we tend to put on our educators from the global majority. Hey, Sonia.
Welcome back.
Yay.
Hey. Yeah, I'm not sure what's going on with technology right now, but we're going to muster through it. This is what we've done for the past 18 months in the virtual. So we've mastered this. Yep. If I heard correctly, the last question that Susan posed was around retention. And so what I am urging my clients that I work with, as I talk with superintendents, as I talk with administrators, is having a very robust strategic plan around how do we offer incentives, not just in the classroom, but at various districts and to be in these spaces. And then that we, like you said, those individuals who are on campus who might not be a person of color, to be in those. And so I already said, we acknowledge, we agree, and then we align. And so now the next level of that is coming up with an understanding of shared language. And shared language is hugely important, not just for teachers in the classroom and administrators. It's important for all stakeholders. So we need to be having these shared language conversations with our students, with our parents, with our community partners, with our boards. They need to represent those students who are in the classroom. And at the end of the day, if you don't represent and want to serve those students who are not performing because of the lack of resources that are available, then you shouldn't be in these spaces. I firmly believe that. I went into this work 12 years ago, and I vowed not to be a DEI firm. And oftentimes when you do a search of my business, it just naturally comes up in that way. But when I have conversations with those individuals who are the decision makers, I try to stress the fact that you cannot achieve diversity, equity, or inclusion in a 1 year, once a time training to your staff. Offer them a certificate that you don't hold them accountable to policy changes and shifts. So that's why I've always made it a matter of, we're coming in to do work around shifting culture and climate. We are going to show how we can be resilient. We are going to come up with strategic plans, and we are going to monitor those plans with surveys at the end and reflective pieces as we go through these learning opportunities. I don't call them trainings, because trainings to me, as a teacher, I can remember sitting in a training like, okay, when is this going to be over? So these are learning opportunities where we can share, and they are working experience where we can apply. And so I think that is where administrators and folks who are making the decisions, the hiring decisions, can really and truly leverage their intuitiveness, wanting to do these things for their districts.
Yeah, I think that's just so crucial, is how we support that. I think the other kind of where I was going was, so we don't have one and done. I also feel like, and I'm wondering what you think, both Susan and Sonia, around how we support educators to talk with one another and to really create those safe spaces. It's one of the things that I've been the most concerned about when we don't have a way to create safety for one another, emotional safety to be able to express ourselves and be our true selves. I think it's really hard for us to get the best out of anyone. And so when our schools or environments are filled with microaggressions, or our staff don't feel safe and we don't have a way to talk with one another, I just feel like if we don't have
Or
that,
not even just microaggressions, like straight up aggressions,
how do we then actually, how do we communicate with one another in a way that's going to be effective and supportive for students is just a kind of a prevailing question I always have. So how do we create that space?
I love in my training modules and my learning experiences is that we start with the shared language, and then we go into opportunities to understand privilege. And that's one of my like key cornerstone places to start, because one, we have to everyone doesn't understand how privilege shows up, right? Sometimes I say that, 90% of folks are very well intentioned, especially in education. I don't know too many people rather, who go into the field of education and they want to cause harm to students, right? I just don't see that as what the goal is. And so if we can agree that that is like a starting point, now let's begin to understand that people are born into certain circumstances and have certain experiences. I always use the song by Erykah Badu, Bag Lady, in my trainings, because we all come with baggage, right? And she's not getting on the bus for a variety of reasons. Maybe it's because she doesn't have fare, the money to get onto the bus. Maybe it's because she has so much stuff that she's going to take up an extra seat and there's only one seat available. Maybe it's that she's rushing and the bus passed her by, right? So there's so many reasons when we come with birth and circumstance that prevents us from understanding one another. And so one shared language is hugely important to that. The second piece is I use Brene Brown's work a lot, and she has a series on blame and shame and vulnerability. And so while I'm asking for people to be vulnerable in these moments, we really and truly do have to curate a safe, brave space and environment for that to happen. And the way that I do that is I start off each school year because I do year-long contracts with the schools and districts and teams. And we start off with a privilege walk. And then we do reflective pieces. And then if someone wants to share their reflective piece based on, what it made them feel like, right? And then we use lots and lots of examples of what those implicit biases and how racism shows up in these spaces, when we use those examples of microaggression and gaslighting. And then when people break them down, they're like, oh my God, I've either done that, or I've witnessed that, or I've been the receiver of that. And then we break down into teams and do a lot of breakouts to kind of understand what it feels like to be the victim, the offender, and the witness in these situations. And in those experiences, I have found that more people come together because they better understand where, that birth and circumstance plus the intersection of you're causing me this harm, where it can go. And then we can identify where the gaps are. And then we can do the work of changing the way, because they really begin to take self out of the equation. Again, I think that removing self from the whole conversation and looking at it from a systemic and institutional and a structural perspective is where the work gets done. Because once we take away that blame and shame, they can say, oh, this thing is unjust or inequitable, and we can do this to change this thing, not me. And in the process that we change this thing, my perspective begins to shift. And because my perspective begins to shift, that means that the culture and the climate begins to shift. And then when new folks come in, they'll adopt this new sense of, oh, okay, we're doing this and this is not accepted here in this space. And it starts with little things like eliminating zero tolerance policies, right? And bringing in things like social emotional learning, and not thinking that social emotional learning is just for students, but that it has to be for staff as well. Like,
Absolutely.
Right.
well, I need
Actually, first and foremost,
first and foremost, right? I need for my principals to understand that if you have a situation that goes on in community, to check in on your Black and brown not staff as well as students, because they might be bringing, and you might say something that might trigger something that might make their performance and production go down. Like that is a real thing. And so those are like some starting points that I think that any team can bring to the table.
It's really powerful place to start, and it really, the taking the self out of it. I'm thinking about this idea around when folks are able to see the systematic way in which they're upon in systems of white supremacy, you can hopefully get folks to this point. Like, of course I'm participating. Of course I'm doing this. I've been born into this position, and it would take great effort for me not to reinforce these things, whoever I am and however I'm entering the system. And I also think of Joyce Dorado's work around the synergistic nature of trauma, and that when we're looking at things, the holistic experience of an individual person is much greater than any individual trauma. So we have to look at the individual incident of trauma, and then how that's playing out in an interpersonal way, and what the system is in our organization, and where this trauma fits in in the history of our culture and our community, and sort of that those things come together to create a full experience. So our responsibility, when we start to untangle all of that and allow people to see how they're participating in that entanglement. And it's not about self. It's just like, I'm a cog in this wheel. How do I stop being that cog?
Absolutely.
I totally agree. Yeah. This has been such a powerful conversation. I want to keep going, but I'm also aware of our time. How can folks connect with you and the work that you're doing, Sonia? Because I feel like we need more people hooking up with you and getting your wisdom.
Absolutely.
So my work can be found at Ascribe Success. That is my web address, ASCRIBE success.com. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram with the same handle. You can find us on Twitter at Ascribe Ed. I would also point people, if you are in the field of education and you make decisions, you are a superintendent, you are a principal. I work with school sites. I work with whole school districts. I work in corporate America as well as in nonprofit, but I would, as a point of reference, especially if you are in the education arena, I would invite you to look at the equity work that Robla School District in particular is doing around this initiative. We have been able to do an entire year's worth of learning opportunities with their entire district, 300 plus staff members. It's a small education. It's a small elementary district in the Sacramento area, but you can see after surveys and teacher engagement what the impact is having on the students and the parents in the community. And I will tell you that the numbers at the last board meeting said that 77% of the staff within that school district wants to continue this work. So even though there's a small percentage of folks who are still pushing back, we do live in the era of just getting out of, Trump out of office. And January 6th was a thing. And during our training, over this past school year, we had to pause and kind of shift what our topics of conversations were for those learning opportunities to address some of these issues, because we know that there is a different way that other folks, if they had shown up at the Capitol, would have been treated. And I say all of that to say that we have a lot of work to do, but there are resources out there. And so I invite folks to take a look at Robla School District. That's ROBLA. School district in Northern California in the Sacramento area, because they've done some incredible work around this topic. And it's been a beautiful experience, allowing me and my partner in crime to come in and lead those facilitations.
That's really great. And I really appreciate the concrete example too of a school district that we can talk to and point to. I think that's really helpful because I think so much of what we learn is from one another and our ability to see it in action. Because I think we get ourselves often as educators caught up in concepts, and sometimes it's harder to move to the actual action part. We deliberate a bit too long sometimes, I think.
Absolutely.
This has been such a pleasure. I'm so grateful that you joined us from the car. Hopefully you have air conditioning on because Sacramento is hot right now.
And at first I had the air on, but then it was getting, you know how cars are sometimes. It's like you're sitting here idle. So I've had the last 15 minutes, it's been like pat down because it's getting hot in here.
Well, you're not showing it. I would be like just drenched and they're looking good. Thank you so much for being with us and joining us and for the work that you're doing. And I'm just internally
this
grateful.
Was such a rich conversation. It's definitely the core of where we sit. And so I'm hopeful to continue to be in partnership and continue to be in conversation with you around this shared vision of equity and social justice and anti-racism in our schools, because it's critical that we are bringing this conversation to our students, to our educators, and to our community. So
and if I can get one last plug in before we go.
Absolutely.
Do it.
I have just finished my first book. I've started several, but this is the first one that's being completed. It's the story of my 7-year-old self when I went to school and I refused to say the Pledge of Allegiance because the last line of liberty and justice for all. And it is a story that families and educators can take and have conversations with young people about trusting their gut instinct and standing encouraged that they can too be right, and that 7-year-olds can be right, and having those tough conversations. I didn't realize, and I intentionally didn't go into teaching to teach young people because I always had young people in my home, and I felt like that would be doing double duty. But I now see different, and that young people are asking questions that are so intuitive. They are extremely smart. And unfortunately, young Black and brown students of color, they are oftentimes adultified and given too much of a responsibility beyond their years and not offered the opportunity to live their childhoods. And so hopefully Monsters and Aliens will be out at the top of the year, and
Monsters and Aliens.
And we'll send you a connection to Mr. Reading with Mr. Lamata, which we had him on our show a couple I don't know, a year or so ago.
I don't know, it's been a minute.
I don't know, but I still watch it in the morning. He reads children's books and he's got a whole following all over the world. Kids in Zambia watch him, kids all over the world watch him. So we always love to connect our guests to each other. We believe in networking and community. So congratulations. That's important and wonderful. We love books.
And kids have so much to offer. So I love that you're framing it that way. I mean, I do strategic planning work, and I'm always like, well, where are the kids? And like, oh, well, they won't know. They can't understand. I'm like, you know what? I'll tell you. A 5-year-old knows whether or not they feel happy or safe in the classroom, and they know what needs to happen to help them be that way. So it really doesn't matter the age. Kids absolutely need to be heard. And our young adults these days, I really feel like they are our future, but they're our ticket out of a lot of the issues I think we have. So we need to empower them and their voices and help them to feel confident. So thank you for your contribution.
And today I think it's the Climate Action Day. Like my kids all walked out of school. My children, my high schoolers walked out and got the little call, but I knew where they were. They're at the Climate Action. So
very cool.
Go young people. Go Sonia.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Sonia. All right, put that AC back on, and thanks everybody. Have a good day.
Class is dismissed. Wasn't that fun? Susan and Megan are always happy to greet you on the next episode of The Awakening Educator. Connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. Education is the foundation for a brighter future. Open your eyes to The Awakening Educator